Welcome to Risky Bitness. For this episode, we're doing part 2 of Is Final Fantasy XIII Really That Bad? Once again, I will be continuing the trend I started last time where I am not appearing on camera in this video. If you would like to see me on camera, let me know in the comments, and if you want to keep me off camera, let me know in the comments. I want to figure out what people like. Also, if you can help me out a little bit and like and leave a comment, and of course share this video as well, that is super duper greatly appreciated. I am trying to grow the channel and reach a wider audience. I feel like my content is finally getting to the point where I'm proud enough of it that I really want to start getting it out there. So please help out in any way you can. I'm going to really appreciate it if you do. Of course, we are currently in the grip of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic. So I hope your quarantine gaming is going well. I know that I have been very much enjoying playing this particular game, although I haven't had quite as much time for the quarantine gaming as many others due to work and family and all those things that get in the way of doing what we do. With all that being said though, part 2 of Final Fantasy XIII, Is It Really That Bad? I will be analyzing and discussing various aspects of the gameplay, including the combat system, leveling up, equipment, crafting, and more. So if you haven't watched part 1 yet, I definitely recommend checking that out first. The link is in the description below, and that video was all about the presentation, the design, the graphics, and the sound. Of course, I gave high marks to all those things. I think they're all great. I had a few little caveats here and there, little dings, but altogether, I think it's a great presentation. It really looks, sounds, and plays out beautifully in terms of the presentation. You'll also find in the description of this video links to my RPG and Final Fantasy playlists. There are a few affiliate links in there to buy this game, as well as other things that you might want to pick up. I played this game with an 8-bit DOE SN30 Pro Plus controller, so I definitely recommend that. It's an excellent controller. No sponsorship or anything like that. I just like it. I think you'll like it too. So with all that out of the way, let's get to it. When I first played Final Fantasy XIII, I thought, this is not a Final Fantasy game. It breaks every rule of what the franchise has been since its inception. There are no towns. You don't talk to NPCs to get clues about where to go or what to do. Instead, you hop onto some rails and you go where they take you, with the exception of taking these, very small excursions from the path to grab treasures. There's these cool little computer terminals that are peppered throughout the game world that act as save points, shops, and upgrade stations. So everything you would normally do in a town, you do at these little computer terminals. The game contains a very large number of tutorials, especially in the beginning, and it kind of begs the question of whether the gameplay is intuitive enough on its own. The need for something like a dozen tutorials implies that the gameplay is just too complicated for the player to learn without basically reading a textbook to have it explained. But, on the other hand, since the game manuals no longer exist these days, tutorials are kind of a replacement for that documentation. It could be argued that this is normally what would have been in the manual, but now instead of being in the manual, it's in the game. You have to kind of draw your own conclusion there. I think it's a little overkill in the beginning, and I actually was getting kind of annoyed with it, to be quite honest. Now, many fans refer to this game as linear, but linear would definitely be an improvement from what this game is. Most of the games in the franchise, even most single-player story-driven games, are linear. There's a storyline and a progression that you have to follow. There's a specific sequence that you have to complete. This is straight up on rails for like 3/4 of the game. Up until chapter 10, which is like 30 hours in or 20 hours in, when you get to Pulse. Sorry, a little mini spoiler there if you haven't played it. Up until then, you are on rails. You're going in one direction and one direction only, and there's no deviating. That's not linear, that's on rails. Linear is, you can't go to the Marsh Cave until first you go to Elfland. That's linear. This is on rails. Alright, now that I'm done beating that nail in, this is the element that the game received the most criticism for. And director Motomu Toriyama famously responded to this criticism by claiming that giving players an open world to explore makes it difficult to tell a compelling story. I'm not so sure that I agree with Toriyama-san. I think there are plenty of games out there with far less linear progression that still tell excellent stories. However, I do think for the particular storytelling methods that they used in Final Fantasy XIII and On-Rails Path actually does make some kind of sense, because the format of this game is an interactive movie. For what it's trying to accomplish, I think it does work. Other games with more open worlds that tell stories aren't telling the story in the way that this game is telling the story. It's not using these frequent cutscenes and this kind of watch a movie, play a game, watch a movie, play a game sort of a layout. To Toriyama's credit, games like Fallout or the Elder Scrolls series, they can really be hard to follow in terms of story due to the larger number of side activities and distractions that you have from the main plot. And I think if you've played Final Fantasy XV, you can see that they sort of went the opposite direction with that. So that might speak for itself. But still, if you look at the other Final Fantasy titles or other successful franchises like Mass Effect, BioShock, Dead Space, among many others, there's definitely a compromise between linearity and an open world that allows for great storytelling without restricting the player to a single path for most of the game. I think this is just another case of Square Enix trying to reinvent the wheel and sort of ignoring everything that came before it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get into the gameplay a little bit more. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below how you feel about this linearity, supposed linearity, or this on-rails sort of gameplay. So apart from the very rigid progression through the game, 13 breaks a lot of other Final Fantasy rules. One thing I found really jarring was the complete and total absence of many fundamental RPG elements. Characters only have two stats, attack and magic. You have hit points, but no magic points, and there's no resource mechanic at all when it comes to spellcasting with the exception of the ATB gauge. It's a really simplified system that has dumbed down the RPG elements to a point where I'm not even sure I would still call this game an RPG. If we want to go down the rabbit hole a little bit, this is a process that has been ongoing in the franchise ever since Final Fantasy VII, where stats like dexterity, constitution, stamina, intelligence, spirit, etc. became less and less important until we've reached this point where they've completely been eliminated. Not having any kind of defense stats and no way to modify defense stats really got me flummoxed. I often found that my characters were taking more damage than I would like, but there's no real way to mitigate damage for an individual character. You can increase their HP, but there's no way to increase damage reduction, and that drives me crazy. There are a couple of accessories that you can equip that will reduce damage by a certain percentage, but that's it. There's no stat. There's no hard-built stat for each character, and it just drives me nuts. Why can't I make my character's defense go from 20 to 25? Why can't I do that? Anyway, it should be no surprise that the equipment is extremely limited here as well. So if you're looking back at 7, 8, and 10, your characters start out with the ability to equip one weapon and one accessory. As they level up their Crystarium, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, they can equip up to 2 additional accessories. Accessories are universal, but each character is restricted to one weapon type only, and that weapon type is exclusive to that character. So Lightning can only use her cool sword gun thingy. Saz can only use his dual pistols that hook that Voltron into a rifle. That's it. What I really dislike about this is that it reduces the number of choices that the player has to make. Role-playing games have always been about careful planning and making choices that directly impact the ability of your character or characters. As a general rule, the fewer choices that are given to the player, the less complex and challenging the game becomes. If you look at older RPGs, and even more so Western RPGs or MMORPGs, there are lots of choices that the player has to make. What equipment to use, how to enhance it, what talents or skills to learn or take, the list goes on and on. The overall gameplay flow is also very, very different from prior Final Fantasy games. You walk along the path, fight the visible enemies on that path, then move on to the next cutscene. Walk along the path and engage with enemies, walk to the next cutscene. At the beginning I found this very annoying. I felt like my game was constantly being interrupted, especially in the very early game before I became invested in the characters and storyline. Overall, it feels more like an anime action movie that you get to play. It's not until later in the game when you arrive in Grand Pulse that you get to actually do some exploring and indulge in some side activities, but that's 20 plus hours into the story, so you can take short detours off the path to find treasures, but they're very short detours, like they're like a few steps. I also found it really strange that enemies drop very little money, and you occasionally find it in treasure spheres, but most of your gil comes from selling components that you don't need. Mostly what comes off of soldiers, they drop incentive chips and credit chips that are worth a lot of gil. And they drop other crafting materials that aren't that good. Sometimes very good ones, but that's another story. I mentioned before that I'm a huge fan of the Final Fantasy games going all the way back to the first one on the NES. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that I was not thrilled with this combat system when I first played it. After all, I had been playing turn-based JRPGs for 23 years by then. For me, that was the way they had ought to be played. JRPG was synonymous with turn-based combat. And this was especially true of Final Fantasy, which has always been known for its ATB system. I thought for sure that turn-based combat was just part of the game. And I do realize that the turn-based system was kind of scrapped with 12, and 11 definitely moved away from it, although that is as close to turn-based as an MMO could possibly be. But still, I really wanted an experience similar to what I'd always known and loved. After all, if it ain't broke, why fix it? And I know that this game technically is turn-based, but is it really? This is a bone that I've had to pick with Square Enix for a long time now, especially in this franchise. With every release, they seem to feel the need to force innovation and fix what isn't broken. When ATB was released with 4, it was a major improvement. The CTB system in 10 was an improvement over that. Each of these built on the strengths of the systems already in place. From 10-2 onward, they seem to have lost their way, just creating a totally new system for each game instead of simply building on what they already had. This reinventing of the wheel does two things. First, it alienates fans who were expecting something familiar, and implies that the last system must not have worked, because if it was good, why would they have changed it? After all, if it ain't broke, you don't need to fix it. 12 had an excellent system where you controlled one character directly, and the other character through the setting up of the gambits. It worked. I had one character who I was in control of, and the other characters, I told them what I wanted them to do, and they did it. Here you control only one character, but change the roles of all 3 characters as needed. Each character has 3 roles that they can switch between, and those roles combine in a number of different ways. The battles are very, very fast-paced, and you actually get rewarded for fighting more quickly. You can still manually choose abilities, but the auto-battle option gives you better chains faster pretty much all the time. The ATB gauge is still present, so it's still turn-based, but multiple characters act at the same time before they wait for the next turn. Based on how many segments of ATB gauge a character has, they act multiple times a turn in rapid succession. So really your only resource that you have to look out for is your ATB. Your ATB gauge fills up, you have that many segments, and that's how many times you act until your next turn, as opposed to the normal acting once per turn. The roles the characters have include Commando, which is a melee damage dealer, Ravager, which is a magic damage dealer, Sentinel, the tank role that provokes enemies and increases defense, Synergist, who uses support magic, and Saboteur, who inflicts status ailments on the enemies. And if you look at the way that breaks down, it's kind of similar to the Trinity in MMORPGs, so I can definitely see the influence still lingering from 11 into 12. Ideally, when you start a battle, most of the time you're going to have a Sentinel, Commando, and a Ravager, and then you can swap it out, Sentinel, Ravager, and Healer. I'm already forgetting the names of the roles, they just called them what I'm used to calling them. And there's a healer role, Medic is the healer role. And you switch it up, when you're ready to just concentrate on damage, you'll switch to, maybe like Ravager, Commando, or Ravager, whatever is available to you based on who is in your team at the time. The goal of each fight is to stagger an enemy by increasing their stagger gauge, and you do this by getting chains. And chains really just refers to accumulating attacks rapidly. There are also some buffs and things that can be added in, which will give you additional chain bonuses to make that happen faster. And of course, different enemies are weak to different things, and those weaknesses will cause the chain meter to go up faster and cause the enemy to stagger. Once the enemy has been staggered, their more powerful attacks will be suppressed, and they take more damage, and they're also easier to inflict with negative status. Once you get to their limit, their chain limit, to get them staggered, the meter keeps on going up, and the higher the number on the meter, the more damage your attacks do. So the faster and more you attack an individual enemy, the more damage you can do to them per attack. Kind of is a rolling advantage. I didn't really like the mechanic of stagger at first. It seemed really unnecessary to me and very gimmicky, almost like a cheap way to make the fights feel more complicated than they really are. But playing it again now, it kind of grew on me, and I find that I like the fast-paced gameplay. There's more strategy involved than I really thought at first. Staggering foes can have different conditions, and you often have to think quickly or frequently change your paradigms, they call it, in order to inflict damage and protect yourself from the more powerful attacks. Special abilities are interrupted by staggering too, so timing it right can be the difference between victory and defeat. You'll also find out that certain rolls, you'll take more damage, deal more damage depending who you're fighting, so there's a lot more strategy involved than I initially had thought. You also get these really cool story battles with the Eidolons, which I was kind of sad to figure out is not Eidolon or Eidolon. That's how I'd been saying it since Final Fantasy IX, but apparently it's Eidolon, in which you have to figure out the specific role that fills the Eidolon's Gestalt meter until it joins you as a summon. And those are a lot of fun, as is using these summons in battle, although that system is a little bit convoluted. Definitely a lot more complicated than it needs to be. I'll put a little clip of it up here, and if it makes sense to you, good, but it probably won't with that explanation. Speaking of Gestalt, that's one of many throwbacks you'll notice here. You'll see the Lindblum, the Palamecia, a few different throwbacks to prior Final Fantasy games. One major issue that I did have with this game is that if your party leader falls in any battle, the game is over. You don't get a chance to revive that particular character. You can just start over from right before that last encounter, so it's not a super big deal, but it's still kind of annoying. I can revive any other party member except for my party leader. It's kind of dumb. It shouldn't be any surprise at all, though, that Final Fantasy XIII does away entirely with experience levels. Unlike combat, Square Enix seems to be content with building on the sphere grid from Final Fantasy X, with the license board in 12, and here with the Crystarium. The Crystarium reminds me a lot of the sphere grid, but it's presented in a really nice 3D style, and it consumes points a little bit differently. Instead of spending a point on a specific tile, you spend your points to illuminate the lines between the points, linking them together and gaining a new stat or bonus ability. Since each character has 3 roles, they have 3 independent Crystaria that can be developed. I've never really been a huge fan of this kind of advancement over traditional experience levels, because it feels like there's no real point of reference that can be quickly accessed to gauge how far you've come. And because the improvements are so incremental, they feel much less impactful than gaining a level and watching all your stats climb. I can't say, okay, I'm ready for this content because I'm level 50. And on that note, it actually actively prevents you from overleveling the content, which is kind of a good thing. In a lot of the original, experience level based games, you could just grind until you were too strong and could just kill everything easily. Here you can't do that because your Crystarium expands with the storyline. You have a cap of how much you can develop it before you pass that next hurdle. I understand the idea behind making a more interactive system for leveling up, though. It kind of comes back to player choice, as I was discussing before. Granted, you don't have various trees or anything with the Crystarium, but you have 3 linear trees, all of which need to be invested in equally in order to have the character be effective. You do have the option of deciding which role to advance at any given time. I find myself saving up points and then using them to fill in gaps when it becomes necessary to do so. For example, if I don't have a strong enough fire-based attack, if I'm frequently encountering enemies who are vulnerable to fire, then I'll spend a bunch of points in Ravager to get there. I talked before about having very little choice in what equipment to use, but I only gave you half the story there. As I played the second time, I realized there is a very cool equipment and crafting system despite the strict and rigid limitations. I, for a second, was tricked into thinking this was a lot more robust than it actually is. But it's still pretty cool anyway. The simplest choice comes in the forms of weapons that the characters can use. You don't just simply pick up a newer and stronger weapon and swap it out like a lot of other JRPGs. Instead, each time you get a new weapon, it has a strength and a magic score. And your first choice is whether you want to increase strength at the cost of magic or vice versa. Most weapons will give you that option. Either it's, you're taking a hit on one or the other. And it's just one of many decisions you'll have to make when equipping your characters, because as you progress through the game, you'll find weapons that have special abilities attached to them. So that presents another decision. Would you sacrifice damage for a faster ATB charge or improved counters? How valuable are the special abilities compared with the direct damage loss? Will this improve the effectiveness of your characters in battle, and if so, how much? There are yet more decisions to be made here regarding your equipment in the form of a surprisingly complex upgrade system. At least I thought so at first. When I first played, I didn't understand or appreciate the scope of this system. You can use these components gained from defeating enemies to upgrade your weapons and your accessories. Now, different weapons do get different amounts of experience and bonuses based on the type of items that you use. I found out there is kind of a way to cheat this system that makes it kind of really cheap. There's basically 2 or 3 items that you can upgrade everything really heavily with, so that was a little bit of a disappointment, but it's still another choice that the player has to make. You have to decide which items and weapons to upgrade, and then you have to think about, well, am I going to have a replacement for this in, an hour? And wonder if it's worthwhile to invest your hard-earned gil in components or your dropped components. Does it make sense to use them now? At first, I didn't really understand the crafting system at all, and I was just throwing random items at my weapons hoping to improve them. That's not really the best approach. In order to get the most out of the crafting system, you have to know which components to use and which ones you can just sell off to vendors to buy better stuff. Overall, though, Final Fantasy XIII looks like a Final Fantasy game, and it even sounds like a Final Fantasy game, but it doesn't play or feel very much like one. It feels like something entirely different, more of an action-adventure game with RPG elements, and very tuned-down RPG elements at that. When I first played this, I didn't like it at all because it was so far removed from what I had come to expect from the Final Fantasy franchise. Playing it again, I found that when taken on its own as a standalone game, it's actually a lot of fun. I've certainly played worse games, and I've definitely played games that I enjoyed quite a lot more. But it would be wrong to say that the product that Square Enix eventually released isn't a good deal of fun. As a Final Fantasy game, it doesn't fit, but as its own thing, it's pretty good. Next time we're going to be taking a look at what I think is the biggest and deepest part of Final Fantasy XIII, that being the storytelling. I can see here as I'm reading my script, I'm already over 20 minutes. The storyline script is going to be a lot longer. So we'll be diving into all the characters, the narrative, and the lore, and I'll try not to make an entire literary analysis out of it. Please like this video and subscribe. If you really want to help me out, leave a comment down below. And I want to really thank you if you stuck it out all the way through this video, 23 plus minutes in, and have been listening to me all this time. I really want to thank you for tuning in and sticking with me. I thank you for your support. Please like, subscribe, share, help me get the word out, help me reach a wider audience. Thank you for watching, and until next time, game over.